Pronta. Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, as the case may be. It's a delight to have so many of you joining in on our call this morning, our panel on labor market policies and social policies post-pandemic, really one of the most important topics in the world. This webinar today is presented by the Center on Global Economic Governance at Columbia SIPA, the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia University in New York, and by the Columbia Global Centers, in this case represented by the Columbia Global Center in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. My name is Tom Trebot. I'm the director of the Columbia Global Center here. My colleague Jan Svenjar is the director of the Center on Global Governance. He is joining me. We'll have a word of welcome for you in just a moment. Welcoming you to this webinar. It's a continuation, this webinar is, of our year-long series on the changing role of the state post-pandemic. So we've done 6 sessions so far in this part of the year and have plans to do more. Jan himself, I'll skip the introduction he deserves, but in the interest of time, I'll say just quickly, he's a distinguished labor economist in his own right, so particularly adept at today's themes and a very keen observer of economic trends and issues in Europe and the transition economies of Central Europe. And he joins us today from somewhere in Central Europe. I'm going to guess it's the Czech Republic, but it could be Romania. Jan, initial words of welcome to the webinar. I have to unmute. Can you unmute?
I'm unmuted. Very good. Thank you, Tom. So let me welcome you all on behalf of the Center on Global Economic Governance at Columbia at SIPA. It's a pleasure to run this series. In fact, we have already for several years done this series in Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, in Beijing, Paris once as well, New York City, various other places. So this year it's much more intensive. Usually it's one lecture. Today we have one of, as Tom said, 6 to 8 series that we're planning this year. And we basically have a group of about 30 economists and social scientists associated with the center at Columbia, plus many other people from around the world who participate in the activities. So let me welcome you all. And Tom, without much ado, go ahead with the introduction.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jan. Today, just to set the stage and without prolonging the introductory part, today's topic is really a call for fresh thinking on what I've called already one of the most important topics of our day, or maybe of any day, that is dealing with the dual crises of unemployment and inadequate social protection in the wake of this devastating pandemic, which has affected the whole world. Around the world, nations recognize the need for their economic systems to build back better, a common phrase used in the United States, while still dealing with the cursed inheritance of longstanding problems such as youth unemployment, women in the workplace and the discrimination against them, informality, especially a problem in Latin America, reskilling, the demand for more workers to be trained in more technological areas. So all of those pre-existing conditions, so to speak, exacerbated by the pandemic and the migration to remote working. And we still have to prepare for new challenges, which we can't even anticipate fully as of today. So lots to be done and a big agenda ahead of us and the need for fresh thinking. As we've been doing with Jan and our colleagues at Columbia SIPA, we've been focusing on a changing role of the state in different national circumstances, but focusing always on one particular country. This year, the special spotlight is being placed on Brazil, a nation and a country very much in the throes of a crisis bordering on social and economic catastrophe. And no, I don't think that's too strong a word. COVID-19 has taken already 400,000 lives here in Brazil, and still the virus rages on, with a particularly vicious impact on the poorest and least educated, who were least prepared to deal with the pandemic in the first place. So the situation here in Brazil, much like the rest of Latin America, maybe because of the scale, more shocking, but the situation in the rest of the Latin America is, in terms of health and social policy, is as I've described it here in Brazil. And Brazil faces the prospect, Brazil and Latin America face the prospect of what might be called another decade of lost growth. So our panelists today are going to help to bring together kind of the world in 75 minutes or so that we have with you this morning about employment and social protection issues, both broadly in terms of the global experience, but also with a special focus on Brazil. Just I'll move to the speaker introductions now, but just to say quickly that this event is being recorded and it's on the record, and it's being broadcast live to our YouTube channel. So there's lots of good ways for you to pick up on today's conversation. For those of you joining us via the Zoom connection, we're all, I know, tired of Zoom, but the Q&A function there at the bottom of your screen gives you, the audience, a chance to ask your own questions and to raise issues for this great panel that we're all privileged to be hearing today. Get your Q&A in there. We'll do our best to filter those questions and to address the issues you raise. There's also a little button for those of you in Brazil, in particular, a little globe at the bottom of your Zoom screen, which allows you to hear the proceedings in Portuguese translation. So we're going to go to following opening remarks with the speakers. We'll have time to delve into and a panel discussion among the speakers. We'll have time to delve into the issues that you raise for us. Let me introduce quickly our speakers. It would take the whole 75 minutes or so to do justice to them, but our first speaker is Stefano Scarpetta. Welcome, Stefano, who joins us from the OECD in Paris. Stefano has been the Director of Employment, Labor, and Social Affairs Directorate at the OECD since 2013 and had a long history at the OECD and the World Bank and other institutions prior to that. He leads the work at the OECD in a number of broad areas very germane to today: employment, labor, migration, health, skills, gender, and tackling inequalities, and contributes to the implementation of the Secretary General of the OECD's strategic orientations in these areas. So his work, Stefano's work at the OECD, covers all aspects of labor market policies in countries around the world. He's constantly, with his colleagues, redefining standards for best practices and urging a comparative view of labor markets and social policy, making the OECD particularly relevant for prospective members such as Brazil and members and other Latin American countries who are already members of the OECD, including Chile. And as is the case with all of our speakers today, Stefano is a prolific author of works both academic and aimed at more the policy-making community around the world. He has his PhD in economics from right there in Paris, from where he speaks today at the École des Hautes Études. So he'll be our first speaker, Stefano. Then we wanted to delve into a case study of Brazil in particular, the emerging economy. It's a focus point today. And we're very pleased to welcome Celia Kostanecki. She joins us from Rio, where she is a full professor at the Institute of Economics of the Federal University here in Rio. She's also Josué de Castro Chair on Inequality at the Institute of Advanced Studies at the Federal University here. At the department, Celia coordinates the highly productive Center for Studies of Inequality and Development, and her research interests go to the heart of today's session with a focus on labor markets, inequality, and the contemporary social welfare state, especially in its Latin American manifestations, I might say. Her most recent publication, I believe in Portuguese, but hopefully also soon in English, is entitled A Social Welfare State in the Age of Reason, the Reinvention of the Social State in the Contemporary World. Celia's academic training is both in political science and in economics, with a PhD from the European University Institute. She's been a visiting scholar at universities throughout the world, has vast international experience, and among those universities, I might add, is one Columbia University in the city of New York. So welcome, Celia. We'll go to you second. And then finally, a great pleasure, Andres Velasco, to have you with us today. Almost any one of your recent career stepping stones, Andres, would be a lifetime achievement for most of us. At present, Andres is the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. So he joins us today from London. His career trajectory has weaved between academia, where he has excelled, and his public positions of enormous responsibility and impact, with landmark achievements to his credit as Chilean Minister of Finance. And it isn't always the case that ministers of finance in Latin America are very popular when they leave office, but Andres was popular enough to consider a run for presidency himself as a candidate for the president of Chile in 2013. He's held senior teaching and research positions at Columbia University SIPA, the Harvard Kennedy School, New York University, and perhaps elsewhere as well. And is also a prolific author of works both accessible to the general audience and to the policymaking community and at the highest levels of academia. He has his PhD in economics from the self-same Columbia University. So that's it, kind of in a rush, and I'm still taking maybe more time than I should have, but I wanted to duly frame in today's discussion, introduce our speakers. And so I promise now, without anything more from me, Stefano, I'd like to turn the screen, the little rectangle over to you and welcome you once again. And thank you again for joining us. Stefano Carpetta.
Thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you. It's such a great pleasure for me to participate in this webinar with Andreas, with Celia, with Jan, and of course with you, Tom. Let me try to share my screen because I'd like to just show you a few slides. Let's see, can you see that?
Yes, we're seeing Stefano.
Listen, Tom, you said it all right, because this pandemic, the global crisis, has been the worst health crisis in a century. But unfortunately, it's quickly becoming one of the worst also economic and social crises. And I think in Latin America, but in many other countries, we are still in the midst of it. Although, of course, with the spread of the vaccination campaign, we hope that we will see the light at the end of the tunnel. Indeed, we have seen tremendous progress in terms of reduction in number of cases and actually fatalities in countries that have been more upfront in speeding up the vaccination campaign. So let me share a few observations about what has been happening in the labor market. Here you have a traditional indicator, the unemployment rate. Basically what we have seen in the OECD country as a whole, in a matter of 2 months, March and April of last year, the unemployment rate went back to the level it had reached after the global financial crisis. So we have lost, if you like, 10 years of improvement into the labor market, but as is shown in this chart, there are very large differences across the board. Of course, the unemployment skyrocketed in countries like Canada and in particular in the US, but also in Mexico, because many of those who lost their job were on temporary unemployment. Unemployment did not increase much in many of the European countries, but while there's been a significant reduction in unemployment in the US and Canada, you see that in Europe, for example, unemployment has continued to increase even during the reopening of the economy in the summer of last year, and then to some extent at the end of last year. Of course, in Brazil was not immune. The impact of the crisis was dramatic in your country, and even there the unemployment rate increased significantly. So the traditional indicator on the labor market performance really does not capture, if you like, the complexity and the difficulty of the impact of the COVID crisis and the basically restriction measures that were imposed in all countries on the labor market. In fact, maybe a better indicators is when we look at the total hours worked. Here in this chart, you have for a selection of countries, here I focus on the G7 countries. In the second and fourth quarter of 2020, the decline in employment, so those at work, but also the decline in total hours worked. Then you can see a number of countries, the little dot, the orange dot is bigger, so the decline has been bigger than actually the reduction in employment. This is because more than ever in history, many countries, European, but not only European, also New Zealand and others, have used massively what we call job retention schemes. So subsidy by the government to companies to maintain jobs and to basically support the wages of the workers. The extent of the use of this scheme has been unprecedented. 60 million workers were covered by this measure in the peak of the crisis last year. In countries like France, more than a third of the total employees were covered by the activité partielle, 30% in my country, Italy, 25% in Germany. So a massive use of job retention scheme to try to limit the extent of the potential job loss. The other point, and which is to some extent unprecedented to the scale, is also that with the closing of the economy, with lockdown, there were of course very few vacancies out there. And we have seen an unprecedented drop in participation. People were no longer looking for work anymore because there were no jobs available for them, and also because they could not even go and participate in an interview. So a dramatic impact on the extensive, but also the intensive margin or adjustment of the labor market. The other thing which I think I would like to highlight is also that this crisis had a tremendously different impact across sectors. Here, just to show you the different type of sector, you see the impact in the first, second, and third quarter of 2020 on accommodation, food services, on arts, other services, and so on and so forth, compared to other sectors, those on the right-hand side of this chart, in which the impact, even during the lockdown, was actually pretty modest. So a very significant focus of the shock in terms of employment losses in some sectors, the service sector, which is to some extent unique because in the past, for example, after the global financial crisis, it was more construction manufacturing that were deeply affected. This time around, of course, it was more the service sector. And of course, the service sector is a sector in which the labor intensity is certainly higher. The other important dimension is that by no means, in theory, anyone can catch the virus, but the impact on the labor market has been hugely disproportionate. First and foremost, I think across all the countries for which we have evidence, those with low level of skills have been deeply affected. First, because many of them were in the so-called essential services, but also because some of them could not actually work from home, telework, and also because they didn't have even the basic infrastructure to be able to work from home. So 50% less likely to have worked from home in OECD country compared to the high skill, twice as likely to have stopped working altogether. Another, I think, interesting point I want to mention about telework is that in the evidence we had, only 5% of employees in the OECD country were working from home before the COVID crisis. During the COVID crisis, this went from 5 to 39% of employment, where people actually been able to telework. So a massive use of this modality of work. The second are those in the informal sector, self-employment, temporary contracts, part-time workers. So sometimes you see we call those in non-standard form of employment. They account for 40% of total employment in the most affected sectors that I showed you before, and they represent a significant share of total employment, where we also include the informal sector. Large impact on these more precarious form of employment and the workers with this type of job. 1.6 billion informal sector workers around the world were deeply affected by the COVID crisis. Third group, not surprising, we have seen that in the past, in previous crises, young people have been disproportionately affected. The youth unemployment has increased 10 percentage points more than the adult unemployment on average in the OECD countries. Here you see in this slide some of the evidence for South Africa, more than 50% youth unemployment, around 40% in Spain, 30%, so large increase in youth unemployment, not many vacancies or even internship or apprenticeship for them. And of course, young people loom large among those on fixed term contract. The only contract actually were terminated to a large extent in many of the countries using this type of contract. And last but not least, certainly women. Again, compared to previous crises, women were on the front line this time. 2/3 of the global health workforce are women. They, of course, hold type of jobs which are more precarious, less stable, and of course, many of them have to basically shelter the burden of unpaid work, which increased dramatically with the closure of the school, but also taking care of the elderly. So this is a very quickly snapshot, if you like, of what seems to be happening into the labor market. Now, what could be the way forward? And let me start by saying that if this was an unprecedented crisis, so was the policy response. If you look at the sheer amount of resources the country put in to try to shelter workers, companies, households, this has been totally unprecedented. We have never seen anything like that. Yet the impact was so dramatic that these strong measures were not able to fully shelter many of those in more precarious form of employment. So I think in our view, there should be a focus on promoting a job-rich recovery. Now that with the vaccination campaign, many countries, we see the opportunity to reopen the economy. It is a time to shift from protecting the existing jobs, in my view, which a job retention scheme and many other forms of support to companies put in place, into start to support in those sectors that are actually expanding and where there are opportunities for job creation. So support those who continue to be severely impacted by the health crisis, because some sectors have not reopened and might not reopen in the very short term. And at the same time, in those sectors that have reopened, try to basically support job creation by even some form of support if it is targeted on some categories of workers, including young people. Encourage business creation and avoid bankruptcies. I mean, there is an interesting phenomenon we have seen across the board. The number of bankruptcies during the pandemic have declined, which is pretty surprising because you would have expected many companies not being able to survive. Yet, bankruptcy have declined, also because there was some support that companies, firms received. I think it would be very important to gradually remove this support, but not all at the same time, and maybe keep it in some sectors still affected by confinement measures to avoid a significant increase in bankruptcies with, of course, a major job loss that will go with it. And as I said, promoting hiring if targeted to specific workers. The other thing which is very unique to this crisis is also that the recovery plan in the US and in many other countries are simply huge in terms of the resources that will be invested. Invested in the new infrastructure, digital and green, but also I think investing in the labor market, investing in social protection, in my view, is a very important element of the recovery plans. The second is to prevent the exclusion and protect workers. Despite the effort with emergency measure to provide additional support to those not covered or weakly covered, I think it is very important to maintain this form of emergency measure for those still affected by the present circumstances with limited activities. The minimum income benefit could be more reactive to allow for temporary asset test waivers. Lockdown measures have also a disproportionate negative impact on the informal economy. And there are a number of measures, including the one I mentioned here for Brazil with the Auxílio Emergencial as an emergency social assistance payment to provide income support to those most affected. Again, the focus on young people, in my view, is essential. Last time, after the global financial crisis, many countries moved shift gear into austerity, and there were limited resources to help young people. And then we have been talking about the scarring effect on young people. I think this time we can do better with targeted measures to help those young people with difficulties. And then again, try to see which of the emergency measures put in place sometimes very fast to provide, to try to close the gap in social protection, which one of these measures could be kept also on a more permanent basis. So try to really invest as part of the recovery in closing the gap in social protection. And last but not least, I think 2 points I want to mention about prepare for the future opportunity, but also risk. I would go skills, skills, and skills. I mean, many of the jobs lost during this crisis will not be recovered. Many of the jobs that are being created will be somewhat different in terms of skill content. This is really the time to invest in skills. But again, even in the OECD countries, as you probably know, access to training and retraining opportunity is hugely squeezed to those who actually need the least training, the high skilled. The low skilled across all of the countries for which we have data receive maybe a third, if not a quarter, of the training that actually the high skill receive. So making sure that the low skill, those whose job is most at risk of being, of disappearing, receive access to training, in my view, is important. But then also a company innovation work arrangement. Again, the lesson from this pandemic is that there may be different ways to actually manage the workplace, but also provide access to some form of minimum social protection to some of those groups weakly covered, including the self-employed, and include those in this new form of employment, including platform workers. I think there is a big agenda out there to really reconsider the social protection and make sure that some form of minimum social protection is given to everyone, almost regardless of the type of contract they have into the labor market. So these are some of the observations I want to share with you. I very much look forward to our discussion with my fellow panelists and with all of you connected. Thank you.
Stefano, that was absolutely perfect as an overview, and I want to thank you very much. Maybe when we come to the commentaries, which will be led by Jan Svenja, we'll look a little more in detail of maybe some of the best practices that you see in Europe and elsewhere that might be relevant to Latin America in particular. But thank you so much, Stefano, for that overview. And now, and you framed it nicely, Stefano. I appreciate that you brought Brazil into the conversation already. Celia, we'd like now to turn it over to you, please, if we could, and tell people, if you can, in 8 to 10 minutes, that's, I know, a mission impossible, kind of what's been going on here in terms of labor markets and social policies in Brazil. Celia, welcome to the call. I think we'll have to unmute you first. That's the one thing that Mr. Zoom hasn't figured out. Yes, go ahead, Celia.
Sure. Many thanks, Tom, for the kind invitation to participate in this important panel. I'm very honored to be here. I guess what I would like to talk about in my initial remarks is the future. So future options for the Brazilian labor market. And by choosing to concentrate on the future, I mean a deliberate choice not to stop at the doorstep of the short term, that try and delineate a vision of sorts. I'd like to share some ideas with you on this. My general question is that given that the main structural problem of the Brazilian labor market is informality, what could be done to improve it? In trying to answer this question, a natural reference would be to look to the past and search for good experiences. Was there any memorable moment in when labor market performed well in Brazil? Well, it turns out that the first decade of the 21st century was one such moment, more precisely from 2004 to 2014. In fact, in that period, formalization was the hallmark. And with formalization came a whole lot of good outcomes, such as higher average earnings and higher minimum earnings, significant reduction of in-work poverty, lesser wage inequality, shrinking gender and racial pay gaps, and even a slight increase in productivity. We should have in mind that informality in Brazil usually increases both in recession and growth periods. So attention is drawn to the novelty of that decade, and that novelty was a set of new policies regulating labor markets. These policies, as many of you very likely know, ranged from tax simplification to credit incentives to increased oversight, more effective labor courts, expanded educational opportunities for the youth, increased social spending, stricter regulation of outsourcing, and even new laws such as the domestic employment law. And formalization was in that moment compatible with both increased employment levels and higher minimum wages, which sort of falsified the old trilemma that we could not have these three good things together. In fact, one highlight of that period was the policy of real valorization of the minimum wage, which was responsible on some accounts for over 6% of the reduction in household income inequality. But the subsequent period from 2015 to the present has seen a strong deterioration of the labor market, a sort of perfect storm in which deliberate choices played an important role. So it's not there that should look to in our search for reasons for hope, for sure. However, we cannot help mentioning two initiatives of that period that added structural obstacles to any attempt at ambitious changes in the right direction. The first one was the reform of the labor code, which was undertaken during the Temer administration, a reform that aimed at flexibilization of the labor market with the legalization of zero-hour contracts, and was coupled with explicit provisions to weaken the bargaining power of workers. These include threatening the financial survival of trade unions and incentivizing individualized bargaining. And all this was sold as a sort of reform that would increase formalization, which it did not. The second structural blow to my mind was the enactment of the strictest fiscal rule worldwide, the so-called Teto do Gasto, a freezing of real public spending that would result in the sequential shrinking of the per capita social spending over the next 20 years, in a country where social provision is famous for being largely underfunded. Both the reform of the labor code and the Teto do Gasto are now inscribed in our constitution. So again, the current period can be said to have helped increase the problems that Brazilian labor market face by not only not addressing those problems, but adding another layer of difficulty. But one might think that in an ideal world, all we had to do was to go back to 2014 and reinstall the policies that were interrupted and institutions that were dismantled. But this, to my mind, is not sufficient, since even that good time, informality, though smaller, remained important, around 36% of the employed. I want to look into the resources of social policy in particular, what it can do to help improve the situation. Tom, you yourself, in a recent paper, after recognizing the merits of the so-called golden age of Brazilian labor market policies under the Workers' Party administration, suggests that we should look to the Nordic model, the Scandinavian model of labor market policies, to complement that experiment. I could not agree more as I wrote my 2012 book that you mentioned, which was written, by the way, during my stay in the University of Columbia. Tom selects from that experience two central components. The first is that a robust welfare state can be compatible with economic growth and general well-being. This includes high levels of social spending and tax burden, combined with a supportive political economy, because social provision is universal. So everyone benefits, though some people pay more than others. The other component that Tom selected is the unique combination of labor market policies, lifelong learning, and unemployment benefits. In a word, this would be more active labor market policies. I would mention here that the best manifestation of this is the famous Danish flexicurity, the combination of flexible labor markets with economically and socially mobile and safe workers. I want to build upon that proposal and refer to an additional dimension of the Nordic experiment that may prove to be able to promote a real transformation in Brazilian labor market, perhaps much deeper than the regulatory policies that were characteristic of the PT era, and more ambitious and in fact complementary to supply-side initiatives. That dimension is the high weight of the public social service sector in the overall employment, which is a mark of Nordic economies. In fact, while supply-side policies such as upskilling, training, and retraining of the labor force are really important, in those economies, they are also coupled with the generation of public quality jobs in the social service sector. As you all probably know, the engine of job creation in Brazil during the golden age of the 21st century was the distributive and personal service sector, which are not particularly famous for having quality jobs, quite to the contrary. So a missed opportunity was the investment in enhancing the share of the social services within the service sector. So we need to have in mind that the expansion of the public social service sector is multifunctional. It is able to fulfill painfully unsatisfied social needs. It might generate plenty new quality jobs, and it would also help improving the productivity of the labor force via increased investments in health and education. Our own work, co-authored by myself and Daniele Machado, colleague from the Federal Fluminense University, suggests that a higher weight of the social service sector might represent much more formalization, better pay, especially the pay of the lowest paid brackets, more employment for women, non-whites, and youth, and more unionized jobs, and lesser incidence of long working hours. In terms of the reallocation of the employment within the service sector, which, as I said, now relies mostly on distributive and personal services, the adoption of that strategy would represent a shift from a share of mere 25% to that of up to 45% of the employment in the social service sector within the service sector as a whole. Just to give an idea of the potential of transformation related to that strategy of public social service deepening, Brazil, in spite of widely held beliefs to the contrary, has a meager proportion of the labor force in public employment, just 12%. For comparison, the figure for the US, for example, is 14.5%, for the OECD is 21.3%, for Sweden, 28.2%, for Denmark, 36%. So our breach is significant and might be explored to our benefit. Much more could be said in favor of this quote-unquote structural change within structural change, but probably there are a lot of challenges that we'll have to face, and I'll leave that to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Celia, for those wonderful, inspiring remarks and succinct remarks. You mentioned your article with Daniela Machado. I thought I'd call it a seminal piece available in English on the so-called golden age in Brazilian labor markets and the problems that came in its wake, and particularly the stubborn problem that you call attention to of informality and rising informality, particularly an evil all over the world, I think, but a particular malady in the case of Latin America. So thank you very much for that. Maybe Stefano, in the discussion that will follow, Jan, we could talk a little bit about the Nordic model. Jan Svenja himself has thought and seen parallels as well. And the Nordic model was something many years ago, I don't want to say how many, but we used to think a lot about in the case of Latin America, but we don't think about it so much anymore. But it does combine high equity and high growth. So it's something worth looking at, I think. But anyway, enough. Andres, I kept you waiting for a synthesis of what you've heard and, of course, your own ideas. of what we should do going forward. Andres Velasco, welcome.
Thank you very much, Tom. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. What a great pleasure it is to be on this panel with my former Columbia colleagues and friends, not former friends, still friends, and of course with Stefano and Celia. I have to confess that I'm a little intimidated because I am on a labor panel with a bunch of labor economists and I'm merely a macroeconomist. So what do I know about labor markets? I'd like to talk a little bit about the crisis, a little bit about labor markets, and also a little bit about political economy, because I think there is no more political and more contentious subject than labor markets and labor market reform. And therefore, we have to be careful not to prescribe a bunch of things that will never happen. But let me just begin with the recent events and the lessons one can extract from the recent events. At this point, it does not require much repeating that this has been the mother of all crises, very unusual crisis. Latin America has had ample experience, and of course, Brazil is a world leader in crises of all sorts: fiscal crises, banking crises, foreign exchange crises, debt crises. We had never had a crisis which was prompted by government telling workers not to work and by government telling firms not to produce. In the jargon of economists, this was the mother of all supply shocks, complemented in the case of Latin America by a bunch of demand shocks as well, because not only was production curtailed and the ability of people to get to work very much curtailed, Latin America also had a brief but very deep episode of capital flight about a year ago in March, April, May of last year. We also had a period, quickly reversed, but a period of about 6 months of terrible terms of trade, which made a dent in people's incomes. There was a massive loss in trade volumes. Even if prices are up, volumes of trade remain pretty low. And for some countries of Latin America, this is not important for Brazil, it's not important for my native Chile, but it is important for other countries in the region. Remittances from workers abroad also collapsed. So you really had a sort of a quadruple whammy, and we cannot be surprised if the impact on the macroeconomy and on the labor markets was very, very nasty indeed. And that much is obvious. What is less obvious, but perhaps more worrying, are the facts that Stefano highlighted toward the end of his presentation. This was not a shock that affected people uniformly across the board. This was a shock that affected a few people very little and which affected a number of people deeply. Highly skilled, well-paid, tenured white-collar workers like the ones on this call, we kept on working from home. We were safe. We received our paychecks. We did not have to get into the subway and risk contagion. And as a result, for us, the pandemic has been fairly easy. For the poor, for the young, for women, for people on temporary contracts, the self-employed, people working on temporary or just no contract at all, the informal worker, the workers selling fruits or candy on the street. For people in that situation, this pandemic has been nothing short of devastating. And this reminds us of something that we should have known all along, but which we too often forget, and which is that in Latin America, labor markets function terribly. They function terribly in good times, and they function even more terribly in crisis times. In good times, or in normal times, employment rates in Latin America are low. Employment rates are low. The share of people of working age who have a job are low. And especially employment rates for women and for the young are very, very low. And my native Chile, which does reasonably well on a number of indicators, does very badly in this respect. Chile has, as Stefano can attest, some of the lowest employment rates of any country in the OECD. Mexico is kind of up there, or actually down there with us. But even within Latin America, Chile has lower employment rates than Argentina, than Bolivia, than Colombia, than Peru, than Brazil, and many others. That's in normal times. In crisis times, the distribution of the people who lose their jobs is anything but across the board. People who lose their jobs are, as Stefano documented, people who tend to be at the very bottom of the income scale, people with very precarious jobs, people with no contract. Which means that any discussion about equality, any discussion about social protection, or any discussion of social cohesion in Latin America, which is not focused directly on the labor markets, is an entirely worthless discussion. We cannot talk about football without talking about the players and the ball. We cannot talk about equality in Latin America without talking about completely unequal labor and employment patterns. The paradox is, and I'm going to say something which is not something I learned in the books, but something that I learned as a minister. The paradox is that no one really wants to talk about this, because we have a debate in Latin America about labor markets, which is frozen, which is ideological, and which is typically not very productive. On the left, the only discussion to be had is a discussion about collective bargaining, which is perfectly fine, except that collective bargaining covers those who are employed and who have formal jobs. And they tend to be middle-aged, middle class, middle of the road, and male. The young, the poor, women tend to be in sectors in which there's very little formal employment, and where there is formal employment, it is typically not unionized. So collective bargaining, the policy that is favored by the left, is a policy that has almost zero impact on the fortunes of the least privileged, the poor, people with no job or very precarious jobs. On the right, all of the discussion is on labor market liberalization. As one businessman once told me when I was a minister, just, get the government, off my back, let me work in peace, no taxes, no regulation, which is of course a barbaric and silly position to take. And as a result, just as the left is weary of any labor market reform, the right is weary of labor market reforms too. And we carry on with labor markets that work badly, which exclude a lot of people and which leave too many people with no contracts, no employment protection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My hope, and this could well be a vain hope, is that the pandemic will make us rethink these very rigid and very ideological positions, and maybe, and I could well be eating my words, a few months from now, maybe change this very frozen political equilibrium and open up a new conversation. First, because again, the data on the unequalizing effects of the shock is so dramatic. And secondly, because we ain't seen the whole movie yet. As both Celia and Stefano mentioned, one of the features of this crisis is structural change, which is a fancy way of saying that some sectors are going to grow and some sectors are going to shrink. Many sectors that produce a lot of employment are going to shrink, including commerce, including lots of services like transport. And we know from previous recessions that job destruction is swift, job creation is slow. And in the middle, you could have a period of prolonged and painful unemployment. So all the more reason to move ahead, be bold, and make change. So what kinds of changes? There's much talk about the Scandinavian model, and I am very, very happy to endorse that. Let me say, as an introduction to the discussion of the Scandinavian model, first of all, that we have to be clear about what we mean by that. Because of course, Scandinavia is a little place, but with lots of different policies. And what we should be imitating about Scandinavia is the structure of the labor market. The flexicurity model of Scandinavia is flex and curity, meaning on the one hand, It is extremely flexible in the structure of labor contracts. Hiring costs are low and firing costs are very low. Therefore, it is a policy of protection of incomes, not protection of jobs. And of course, it has a security component because government spends a lot on labor policies that are sort of active with a lot of retraining, a lot of skilling, but also a lot of discipline. That is to say, you get very generous and unemployment compensation checks as long as you're showing up at 8 a.m., even if in a very cold, winter morning in Copenhagen to get reskilled, to get retrained. You don't show up for 3 days running, the check no longer comes to your house. And as a result, it is a very particular set of labor market institutions, which we don't really find any place else in the world. It is much more regulated than the US or the UK, but it is much less regulated than Latin America. And of course, it has bigger spending on active labor market policies pretty much than any other corner of the world. This is a very appealing proposition. I'd be happy to take that flag and run with it. But before we get too excited, let us note that that is not what is in the agenda today in Latin America. What is on the agenda today in Latin America is, in some quarters, a very big push for UBI, for universal basic income, which I think is not a good idea. It is not a good idea, first of all, because a country like Brazil is going to come out of this crisis with debt to GDP ratios of about 100%. So you'd have to tell me how a country like Brazil would pay for UBI. Even Chile and Peru, countries which had very low debt to GDP ratios, are going to come out of this crisis with about 50% of GDP. Granted, interest rates are lower than they ever have been, but they're only low at the very short end of the curve. In Brazil, if you want to borrow short, the interest rate is very low. If you want to borrow long and you're the Brazilian government, the interest rate is not so low. And as a result, there is an element of fragility there that is very, very important. But fiscal considerations or financial stability considerations are not the only concern here and should not be the main concern even. What I worry about is social cohesion. And I find it very difficult to envision a situation in which we have integrated and cohesive societies in Latin America without good jobs and good wages. So it seems to me that what we need is a policy of creation of good jobs and good wages, not just for middle-aged white males, but for women, for the young, and for people who don't have a lot of skills. And in my book that is called, first of all, if you're going to spend some government money, and you should, that's called employment subsidies, a negative income tax, an aggressive use of government monies to subsidize incomes, particularly of low skilled. You probably want to subsidize labor supply, meaning you want to make sure that that young man or woman who would like to work without a contract and get a bigger cash payment will have incentives to actually formalize the job. But you also want to subsidize labor demand because with big social charges, hiring low-income workers is sometimes not very appealing from the point of view of employers. There is a role for minimum wages here, but not in the vain hope that you simply increase the minimum wage and all will be well. You could use the minimum wages actively insofar as you're also doing fairly ambitious employment subsidies. If you're going to increase the minimum wage alone, particularly during a period of low growth, you will get job destruction, you will get greater inequality, and you will get greater inequity. So yes, there is a role for minimum wages, but a smart role for minimum wages only or especially if coupled with employment subsidies. In addition to that, you need much more active policies when it comes to skilling and to reskilling. A lot of the retraining in Latin America is wasted money. I could bore you with a dozen anecdotes of why my own country wastes $300 or $400 million a year in terrible quality retraining schemes, not skills. But of course, that does not mean that retraining is no good. Retraining is absolutely necessary, but we ought to be doing it better. Let me end with one last thought. We need to do all of this. We need to be much more active in reforming the labor market, but we also have to grow. I frankly do not think that there was a labor market, golden moment in Brazil. There was a growth golden moment in Brazil. And when the economy grows very quickly, then of course, labor market indicators look good. When you have the biggest recession that you've had in decades, like Brazil had in recent years, labor market indicators look very bad. But of course, that says absolutely nothing about the virtues of labor market policies in one government or the mistakes allegedly made by labor market policies in a different government. It simply says that when the labor market is very tight, things look good. When the labor market is very soft, things look terrible. So we need to grow again. And for that, we need all the standard things that we know, plus smart industrial policies. Not Gilma industrial policies, smart industrial policies. Let me stop there. Thank you.
All right. Let me thank you all three. It was a terrific, it's been great performance. Obviously, many ideas, very rich for thought. So let me just offer a few remarks kind of on top to start the discussion. So obviously, we're going through an incredible recession. The government closures, restrictions that government imposed created additional layer of uncertainty, which the pandemics itself brought about. In uncertainty, firms delay investment, consumers delay consumption, output goes down even more. That translates into the labor market. Labor demand is derived demand from output demand, right? Plus, in addition, all the other measures in it. And there's been dynamics, which wasn't the V shape or U shape that people predicted, but it was the K shape that people called it. People who are working in home office did quite well. Those that didn't and who were affected by government restrictions obviously didn't do very well either. Income distribution has, in many countries and many situations, worsened in terms of widened. Poverty has increased, right? And the data, especially last week from the United States, indicated managerial compensation has increased. So that is, a serious situation in terms of where we are. Now, different countries have a different experience. As Stefano showed, countries that had very little in terms of protection in the labor market, like the United States, unemployment shot up dramatically. In fact, given that the shock overall was similar, say in Europe and the US was a good indicator because the European labor market had all the protection that Stefano described in terms of cushioning the impact. But the impact was equally big. I mean, Europe has significant underemployment, where US had open unemployment in the immediate shock, right? After that, you have the out of the labor force flow, which was very significant. So unemployment data don't look as serious as, in fact, the impact is. And so that is, very, very important. China has done better in the sense it started earlier. So it was like a quarter ahead of everybody else in terms of the impact of the data, but managed to have a shallower impact. And within the authoritarian system that they have, managed to have actually a quicker rebound. US seems to have a quicker rebound than Europe. In that sense, we unfortunately see a similar outcome as we did after the financial crisis and the Great Recession. And let's not forget countries like India. Speaking of informality, in India, 80 to 90% of employment is informal, right? So there we're talking, and now with the wave of pandemics that's hitting India now, it's really a very, very discouraging picture that you have there. So we have that, and then I think, as Andres pointed out, many countries have increased the debt level. Brazil, US are crossing the 100% of GDP in terms of public debt, and even countries like Chile and Czech Republic and others that started low are significantly increasing the debt level. So we're also entering the uncertainty territory of how to deal with things with high level of government debt, right? That's new, that's sort of, we haven't been there in peacetime. In wartime, yes, but those are different times, right? So a huge amount of uncertainty kind of all over. And within that, the functional distribution of income started changing already for decades, but increased even now, meaning that less of GDP goes to labor and more goes to capital. And that is another aspect of the uncertainty. Biden in the United States seems to go decisively in trying to change that. It's not clear that other countries will follow and will be able to reverse that long-term trend that's exacerbating even now. And so it is a really critical type of situation, and labor market bears the brunt. That's where people are, that's where they are bearing it. At the same time, we see a big trend towards digitalization. And the danger is, again, that the rich countries are going to move there faster and will be more successful, and adoption of new technologies, et cetera. And so when you look at it sort of where the action is and where the workers are going to benefit a lot, it's again going to be probably in the richer countries, including China in this case, because it is technologically moving in that direction. And here I'm a little bit worried, and I'd like us to talk a little bit about the retraining, the active labor market policies, and so on. Andres already mentioned that there's been a lot of inefficiency in at least some parts of the world. My reading, and Stefano, you can enlighten us on that, is that the carefully done studies in the US and elsewhere sort of indicate that the effect of the active labor market policies of returning programs are not always very encouraging. So we spend quite a lot of money, but when we do controlled experiments, then the placebo people tend to do about as well as those who go through the training program, which is very discouraging. Obviously, that poses the question of what kind of retraining is good, how to do it, and so on and so forth. So I think that's really important. And I would add that the cohesion that Andres has mentioned, and I think was also in Celia's discussion underlying all the issues of how the labor market should really be structured and governed is very important, because I think the societies are now much more polarized than they were before. There are political reasons, et cetera, but there are important economic reasons. And the institutional setup in the labor market, in the end, is going to be the structure on which all this is going to sit, and what kind of tax and subsidy policies, what kind of smart regulation, and the flex security is a very good example of it, in the sense it's provide the flexibility in terms of functioning of the economy, but it protects income, but not jobs, because jobs change very fast. I mean, to give you an example, if we looked at the top 20 firms in early 1990s, there would be a whole bunch of European firms, right? Now there is not a single European firm in the top 20, right? So that's really an example where if you miss the boat, as the Europeans missed on digitalization, you can have incredible impact. And it's on the production side, of course, it's in the labor market, it's in the social cohesion that is so important. So let me stop here and return it to you guys. I mean, it's been terrific what you've provided here. And I think we have, Tom, I think we have about several hours worth of discussion here.
I'm up for it. I don't know if we can hold the panelists that long, but we do. I think the next point naturally is, let's go back in the order in which people spoke. I love the cross fertilization that occurred. Stefano, maybe we can turn to you to react to what you've heard, and in maybe just a few minutes of supplementary content. Then we'll go to you, Sally, and then back to you, Andres.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you to Celia, Andres, and Jan, because they brought so many absolutely essential points to the conversation. I won't be able to give justice to the many points, but let me just very telegraphically go to some of the points. You said, Tom, okay, what are the lessons we can start to sort of learn from the way in which the labor market has been impacted by this crisis, and also by the policy response? That's a big question. In 2018, in December 2018, we just released at UC the new job strategy, which is basically our overarching framework to the way in which we think the labor market could be managed. This new job strategy focus on the quantity of job. We need more jobs, of course, also because, as Andres said, the employment rate are low in a number of countries. The quality of job, we actually specify what we mean by that. But then inclusiveness. So basically, we have to make sure the labor market brings those who are underrepresented into the labor market, and resilience and adaptability. Now, I think to some extent, the countries that have managed relatively better are those in which they have a more resilient labor market. And I was referring before to the job retention scheme. This is a subsidy that go to company to protect jobs, to keep jobs alive. right, in case of a major sudden shock. In general, these are for demand shock, so they have to be temporary and well targeted. And actually, the employer have to co-pay to make sure that actually we are not basically subsidizing jobs which are not viable. I would argue that in Europe, or for that matter in New Zealand and other countries, without these job retention schemes, the immediate impact of the crisis would have been much more devastating in terms of open unemployment. Problem is that those countries who introduced job retention scheme in the middle of the crisis, this scheme did not work. You need to have the scheme there. The employer have to know of the existence of these schemes. You have to make them as simple as possible in terms to access, and you have to make it very clear that they are not subsidies that goes nowhere. It's a subsidy to protect the job, but then you have to maintain that position open in the short term. So job retention scheme. Second, active labor market policy. I fully agree with Jan. I mean, if you look at the evidence, empirical studies, and meta-analysis, per se, pouring money into active labor market policy is not such a good idea. The return tend to be very low. Yet, some active labor market policies do work pretty well, especially not in terms of increasing employment in the short term, but creating more stable job position, less precarious form of employment, more stable jobs. That's what matters. But again, we will never at UCD say, you know, now you got a major crisis, please double the amount or triple the amount of money to active labor market policy. If you do that, you don't have the institution in place to manage these additional resources, you're going to waste your money. And the big problem that we have been facing now, even after the global financial crisis, was that countries pour money into active labor market policies without actually having case managers in the public employment service being trained or being available to actually use this money properly. So it was a little bit of a waste of time. One example there, some countries, the big example here is Australia, where basically subcontracted completely the job placement by creating a quasi-market with private sector. And these companies in the private sector, in order to be basically to have a contract, they have to go a very, very strict scrutiny and be selected. They have a star system. Those with more star get more resources, and actually they have to show that they perform in placing workers. Other countries, they have not moved into that, but they are basically introducing the private sector with very strict contract to actually supplement what the public sector, public employment service can do. I can go on, but there are a number of examples that actually seems to be somewhat promising. Now, I think Andrea said it all. Even within the Nordic countries, there is no such a thing as a flex security model. I mean, there is one in Denmark, and even that can be questioned to some extent. If you look at Sweden, Finland, Norway, they are quite a different system. But there are some similarities, and let me just super quickly go through that. One, in my view, that these are countries that have a significant social preference for less unequal or more egalitarian societies. So there are countries that tend to accept the fact that income taxes can be pretty high, and actually that the government can redistribute. Actually, redistribution has declined even in this country, but not to the extent we have seen in other countries. Second, I think the social partners in these countries have a significant level of trust, and they do manage themselves a number of key programs. I mean, when we think about unemployment benefits, which tend to be pretty generous in these countries, these are managed by the social partners, by the employers and the trade unions. They do manage employment benefits. So that's why they're very strong incentive to push people back into job as quickly as possible. Related to that is a notion that actually works in this country, not much in others, which is called the mutual responsibility. We give you pretty generous benefit, but you actually do search for a job. If we ask you to participate in a training program, you do it. If you don't, you actually do not receive the benefit anymore. So bringing this notion of mutual responsibility is essential if you want to scale up some of these programs. And I think this brings me to the point that Andres, which is the universal basic income. Frankly speaking, it's not a good idea in any country, and certainly I would not recommend that for Latin America. There is a number of experiments. There is one pilot study that was run in Finland, in which actually they say, okay, listen, for the long-term unemployed, we give you the same level of benefit, but we don't want you necessarily to jump into the first job. By removing this conditionality, they hope that people were waiting, maybe searching better and finding a new job. Basically, they have to interrupt this pilot because it was a mess. We have done through our micro-simulation model some estimate about what would mean in OECD country to introduce a universal basic income. This basically would mean, unless you, as Andrea said, you basically spend much, much more public money, withdrawing all the very well-targeted income support that go to those who actually need it the most. Get rid of all of that, keep only pension and basically disability benefit, and then put all the money you have saved into universal basic income. So you get a lot of losers among the poor, among those who need benefit, need support, and you're actually giving some money, some little money to those who don't need it at all. So I mean, from a fiscal point of view, universal basic income in my view, doesn't make too much sense. However, as Tony Atkinson said some years ago, some targeted basic income actually does make sense for those who have difficulties in actually coming into the labor market or actually working full time. So something which is targeted, which is equivalent also to a negative income tax, is something that I think would make sense. And in fact, some countries are experimenting with that. So, I mean, these are just some quick reaction, but I think it was a fascinating discussion. I could go on and on, but I prefer to hear from my colleagues in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. Could not have asked for a better reply than that. We'll turn to Celia. And I don't want to focus too much on Scandinavia. We'll over-focus on it, but it's almost when we talk about Scandinavia, it's like a unique mutation of the human spirit occurred there, and they have a preference for equity and so forth. But I think Celia was suggesting the reason those institutions became consolidated was after a long period of difficulty in the various Scandinavian economies, but mainly because those policies were proved to work. Not only do they send a lead the OECD over many years in terms of economic growth and rates of employment and skill levels and so forth. So you can't copy and paste that anywhere, but I'm going to try to say that Nordic exceptionalism, I think, may be slightly overrated, and there are things to learn. But Celia, I didn't mean to make to interrupt the flow here. Let's turn back to you. Are you with us, or I don't see you? Celia, are you still with us, Celia? Oh, we may have frozen.
No,
Celia?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I can't. You're not moving, so I got a little concerned. Go ahead, Celia. Please,
okay.
As to what you've heard in the light of your opening remarks, please.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Well, first of all, I'd like to clarify that my main point in this brief remarks that I made was trying to answer the question: what is the role? What if the state has a role in the sheer creation of jobs, and also a role in support the creation of jobs in the private sector? So the idea of the state having a role in the sheer creation of jobs, of course, we can have deal with this in a very old-fashioned. But if you look at the Nordic experience, you see that it's important that the sheer amount of jobs that have been created in the social service sector have been very important in those countries. They have the structure of the employment is heavily based on employment on those sectors. And why is this important for us to discuss the case of Latin America and Brazil? It's because those those jobs that are created in the social service sector are formal jobs. They have, a lot of qualities, good qualities that we would like to imitate. The point that Andres raised, we need jobs, but good jobs, right? People with good wages. We don't want jobs that put people in poverty, in working, but poor, still poor. So this was a question that I tried to address, right? And I think that there are a lot of things that can be explored in this area. First of all, the fact that social services are badly needed in our countries. We have, they are basically underfunded. People have unfulfilled those basic social needs. So the expansion of these social services will meet these unfulfilled social needs. This would be a good thing. The other thing is that by expanding these social sectors, social service sectors, you would expand good jobs that would be formal. So you would avoid that kind of stratification that Andres mentioned between workers who are unionized and have access to good opportunities and those who are not unionized and don't have access to good opportunities. And and also we could look at those social service sectors as sectors that are providing opportunities to increase the productivity of the labor force. So what I'm trying to argue here is that we can have a demand side and a supply side kind of intervention that is related to the increase of the weight of the social service sector in the economy. And it is the service sector in the economy who is the sector who creates the jobs in our contemporary time. So if we move to a heavier weight of the social service in it, we will have all these good things that we'd like to have in our countries. Of course, this is a long way to go. It's very difficult to have all the macroeconomics in the middle, have all the politics. But I think we should start to think about it. And I'd like to hear if this idea is crazy or if we can do something about it, or if we can really explore this intuition. And why this intuition was in a certain way corroborated by our research on the kinds of features of the social service sector in the Brazilian economy. So this is a sector that is mostly formalized, and that people who are in the lowest pay brackets have the highest level of pay, and we have a quite not very big inequality between wages within this sector. And it's very women-friendly, it's youth-friendly, non-whites are overrepresented in the sector. So there may be something for us to think in terms of strategic thinking, okay? Thinking in the future, what kind of development project we would like to have in our countries. And if we agree that informality is a problem, it may be interesting to explore this road of increasing the weight of the social service sector. And that's what I meant when I said that I was going to be inspired in the Nordic model, because the Nordic model does not only have the so-called active labor market policies as very important, but they also have this feature of having a huge social service sector. Actually, the two things are somehow connected, because education is part of increasing productivity of workers. Lifelong learning is part of it. It includes early childhood and education care and all the phases of the educational system, and also all kinds of training and retraining policies. So that's what I meant. And I think maybe you could discuss this a little bit. Thanks, Tom, for giving me the opportunity to express better my ideas.
Thank you very much, Celia. And we unexpected last night, we had our first panel. It's a 2-panel sequence, and unexpectedly, Joseph Stiglitz showed up on the last night's panel, and right, Jan, and offered some very trenchant remarks, as you would expect. But particularly, Celia, you seem to endorse very much what you're saying about shifting the structure of employment in the social service sector. It has multiple benefits, moving people out of personal services, for example, construction, domestic services, and so forth, and into the provision of social services. So, no, your point is very well taken.
Tom, if I may just add that Tony Atkinson, in his late book, also mentioned that when he discusses the fatalism with which we face the problem of technological change, that we're going to lose jobs, etc. And he mentions that a possible way out would be exactly to invest in the expansion of the social service sector. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Celia. Andres, we're going to turn back to you now. I might ask maybe Stefano and Jan to kind of filter through some of the Q&A there. If we have a few minutes, which we may not have, to go to if there are particularly relevant points being raised there, if you can help me look through, and I'll turn to you in just a moment. But Andres, you played your role so well as I knew you would, and provoked a lot of reactions from people. And I just let's turn back to you now for maybe final summary where we really do go in Latin America toward, because it seems to me, and I think what you brought to the discussion is this political cohesion and social cohesion element, which is a sine qua non. We can design good policies, and some places they even appear to be working. But if the powers that be, Andres, don't want to go in that direction for institutional reasons and protection of long-held privileges, it's sort of useless, but it also leaves it as a bit of a dead end. I don't know if that's good or not, but I just want your own thoughts. But my thought is really, where can we go next, Andres, as you seem to close off a lot of possibilities and hopeful opportunities. And I wanted to give you a chance maybe to address again what your active agenda would be in Latin America today when you come back to being, for example, Minister of Finance in Chile. I can't hear you, Andres. I'll mute myself.
I was saying, been there, done that. not a movie I wish to watch again. We have very little time, and we ought to take some questions from the audience. So let me just say two things. My one-line answer to your question, where do we go next, would be the following. We need to understand that employment policy and social policy are one and the same. Without an agenda for good jobs, a lot of the discussion of social protection and of equality-inducing policies in Latin America is basically hot air. And for that, Stefano said it, I'm going to emphasize it here. The idea of a negative income tax that is used aggressively, the idea of linking public monies, which have to be used generously but smartly, to creating high productivity jobs is, to me, the linchpin. There's a lot of stuff that goes around it. Some of it is Scandinavian, some of it is not, some of it is hopefully South American as well, but that's the key idea. On the social sector and Celia's proposal, I'm going to agree with a couple of things and disagree with a couple of things. First of all, yes, this pandemic has reminded us that there are some heroic people upon whom we rely for our health and safety. They're typically not well recognized, they're typically not well paid, and societies ought to do more. That much, I think, is clear. Secondly, there's going to be an expansion of this sector no matter what, for one very simple reason. Societies are aging. Countries like Brazil or Argentina or Chile are in the middle of a very quick demographic transition. People like us on this call will soon be, requiring a lot of services, and therefore this sector is going to grow. So that is also a point in which I am in agreement. Do I think that this is the solution to all of our employment and labor market ills? No, I don't think so. For one very basic reason, we want to move people into jobs where productivity is high and growing. And if there's one thing that we know, is that the service sector is typically a sector of productivity that grows very, very slowly through time. The problem of Latin America, and this includes Brazil, is that we don't make enough things that the world wants to buy. Yes, Brazil has Embraer, and we all, whenever somebody says, oh, there's no technology industry in Latin America, somebody says, oh, but you're forgetting Embraer. Yes, there is Embraer, but there's very little else. Brazil is a huge economy that makes things that Brazilians want to buy, but Brazil makes hardly anything at all that the rest of the world wants to buy. We need to move people into jobs that make things and deliver services that, the 6.5 billion people, however many people there are who live outside Brazil, want to part with their money for. And that is a challenge about which we're doing very little. So the jobs policy is also an employment policy, and the employment policy is also an innovation policy. If we don't think of 3 bits in one sentence, and if we don't make that one sentence into one policy, then I'm afraid we're going to have a lot of good intentions, but a lot of very bad outcomes.
Andres, and you're right in so many respects, including that we are beginning now to run at the end of our time. Jan, I wonder if at this point I could turn it back to you, because
Sure. No, I think that it's really been tied together very nicely. Let me just stress what has been said in a different way, maybe, that it shouldn't be just focused on high wage. It's high productivity and therefore high wage, right? And the productivity is not just sort of physical productivity, but how much do you sell what you produce for, right? So the value of it. And that's where the example I was giving, where the US and China, to some extent Asia, moved to high value products, and Europe stayed with the more traditional ones, has left Europe behind. So in that sense, the innovative part, which Andres just mentioned now, is really important. And this is a big challenge. And education comes right into it, high quality education, putting emphasis on high quality education, stressing excellence, because from that you will develop the Embraer. From that, you will develop Nokia, right? From that, a country that's not necessarily the US can do it. But it's an uphill struggle because the multinationals are headquartered, in some of the advanced countries plus China. And frankly, there are economies of scale to where you do the inventive and innovative product. You bring the scientists together, and rather than sort of outsourcing the scientific part necessarily further out, you then sell things worldwide because the cost is low in distributing. But the economy, so the question is, can you get into Brazil or India or countries like that, sort of some of the very innovative and inventive part, and have several Embraers, and they have incredible spillover effect. So the effect there is worth spending some effort and government, thinking and policies there. So yeah, I would like to stress that because that I think is very important. All right, in terms of, there were some questions. There was one that related to me and my question about management compensation. I didn't mean to say that managers do not deserve to be compensated. They certainly do. What I meant was that last year, many people had to sort of do without increases or, take even in the policies that the European governments had for keeping workers attached to firms, there was some decrease in compensation. They got 90% or 80%, something like that. So it's time where the managers, even if they are, very good, out of solidarity, if nothing else, could actually, share in that. That was the point there. I didn't mean to be anti-managerial compensation. All right. I think that, Tom, we are nearing the end here.
Reluctantly, I will conclude. Maybe the best way to conclude is thanking Stefano, Celia, Andres, and you, Jan, eminent labor economists. I think you held your own very well, Andres, among these labor economists. But we certainly were treated to the finest in what's happening in labor economics, and you can see that part of the discipline of economics is really at the forefront. Andres has sort of given a closing thought, and I just think that I've got less than 5 minutes here to do this, as people have to start moving on to other obligations today or enjoy your evening in Europe. But I wanted to give maybe just a 1 minute conclusion, that better than me summing it up, maybe in reverse order. Celia, first to you, Stefano, then to you. And Celia, you brought up this intriguing point, many intriguing points, but one that you didn't have a chance to elaborate on was women-centric policies. And yesterday we saw data from Brazil that showed the entire loss in employment has been literally focused 100% on women's jobs. And I wonder, Celia, you can say whatever you want, ignore that if you will, but if you want it in your final minute or so to address that particular issue, that might be very welcome. Celia. I think you're muted again, Celia.
She's muted, yeah.
Thank you very much for this, Tom. And I think that what you mentioned is very important. But I think that my proposal somehow includes a concern with the question of women labor things and the youth especially. But I'd like to, as a final remark, to say the following. If we skip the UBI option, okay, we have no other alternative than to create jobs, right? And the service sector is nowadays the job engines. And we know that inside the service sector, the distributive and the personal are the bad ones. So the good ones are the productive services and the social services. And we also know that the productive services are very productive. So they are not within the reach of the BOMO disease costs, right? I think this is something that is quite consensual in the literature. But there is an interesting interaction between the productive and social services that we are not maybe paying the attention that is needed, which is the fact that social services are able to provide an education and healthy labor force that in turn will be able to fulfill jobs created by the service sector, the productive sector. And this is a subsector that is increasing in terms of jobs that are being created. So this kind of interaction interests me a lot. The way in which the social service expansion can help to expand the productive service, which is a very productive subsector within the service sector, which in turn is the creator of jobs. So if we are skipping the UBI alternative, that is to say nobody has jobs, all you have to do is to share income and wealth. If we want to stick with the need to create jobs, I think I don't see any way out than to also, beside other policies that were mentioned here, than to involve the state in the role of providing these opportunities that will be good for on many aspects. And a final thing is that the problem of environment is very, very important. So if our economies are moving towards services that they have been moving for a long time, but even in Latin America, they're moving very fast to being a service economy and service sector job generator. It's very important that we see that the fact that the weight of the social service within the service sector is also good in terms of environment, because we are in a sector that is intensive in people, as Tom Atkinson has said, and not in natural resources. It's a low emitter of carbon. So there are a lot of interesting aspects that might be developed. So this is my final comment. Thanks, Tom, for the opportunity.
Thank you. Very, very astute comment. It is Stefano. The final minute of commentary is yours, Stefano. Then I'll thank and we'll adjourn. Stefano.
Thank you, Tom. Listen, 2 points, 30 seconds each. One is a worry, and also what I think is a great opportunity. In many countries, the government are spending a lot of money into the recovery plan. In my view, part of this money, apart from investment in infrastructure, green, digital, should actually be on addressing some of the challenges we've also been discussing today. I know that there are limitations in some countries, because I think this crisis has simply shown these huge gaps, and I think this will be an opportunity to try to close them. If we don't do that, I think we might find ourselves with large debts to GDP ratios in many countries, and still the same problem we come up with at the beginning of this pandemic. So in my view, there are huge opportunities. The first time in peacetime in which such a large amount of resources, public money, were actually pouring into the economy. The second point, and here I repeat to some extent what I said before, education. I mean, it's a supply side, but I think there is a lot to be done in Latin America and in many other countries, not only through formal education, but also through continuous education and lifelong learning. Again, you can waste a lot of money in that, but actually you can use it in a way. And I think the digital technology there opens huge opportunity for actually using, identifying, designing training programs that actually can reach out to many workers, including workers into the informal sector. So I think part of the money could be to actually offer some form of training, retraining, because the new jobs, and there are many that will be coming with the recovery, might be quite different from the one that got lost during the crisis.
Thank you so much, Stefano. We're really a minute over now, but Jan, you'll come back on the screen with me. Just a final thanks from me. Jan, you have the final word, and you'll move to adjourn. But thank you very, very much. This has all been recorded.
Give a minute to Andres. Andres, do you have a last minute thought that you would like to say?
Oh, I thought I'd started with him, but go ahead, Andres. No, he does, but we can't hear him.
I think we can more fruitfully hear a wrap up from Jan. I've said my 2 bits, but thank you anyway, and it's been really a delight to participate in this panel.
Thank you, Andres.
Thank you, all of you. I think that the best summary is that you've identified, I think, the very key issues, which is not easy. And you've also, I think, taken a very good stab at what's even more important, and that is what to do with it, right? Which way to go. And obviously, there are a number of directions. I think that the good thing is that there are considerable resources that are available. And I think the word of caution that comes from all of you is use those resources wisely, because it's a unique opportunity. And it's combined with another opportunity is that we have historically low interest rates. And even though some of the long-term interest rates in some countries are high, in others, the medium-term interest rates, 10-year bond in Germany isn't even negative, et cetera. It is a unique opportunity. And I would stress that when businessmen think of infrastructure, they think of human capital as well. So education, which we're all stressing, is an important part of infrastructure, and governments should think of it that way, that really the investment into infrastructure is not just physical infrastructure, but also the human capital, which is very important. So let me end on that note and thank you all very much. This was a terrific roundtable.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jan, Andres, Cecilia.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Nice to meet you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.